Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the untold emotional stories behind Hollywood's most talked about lives. Today's story isn't about headlines or rumors. It's about silence, endurance, and what happens when someone finally chooses themselves after years of carrying emotional weight alone. For a long time, Porsche De Rossi appeared calm, loyal, and unshakable beside Ellen DeGeneres. From the outside, their marriage looked like one of Hollywood's rare success stories, a symbol of love surviving pressure, fame, and public scrutiny. But behind closed doors, things were far more complicated. This is the story of what happens when love exists alongside imbalance, when devotion slowly turns into self-erasure, and when one person realizes that staying quiet may cost them everything they are. This is not a story of villains or victims. It's a story of two people changing at different speeds, and the quiet moment when one of them finally says, "I need myself back." For years, Porsche De Rossi chose silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because loyalty felt safer than honesty. She carried discomfort privately, believing that endurance was the price of love. Friends say she convinced herself that every relationship has seasons of strain, and that weathering them quietly was a sign of strength. Publicly, she remained supportive, composed, and unwavering. Privately, the emotional pressure kept building. The scrutiny of fame, the imbalance in emotional needs, and the responsibility she carried inside the marriage slowly began to fracture something within her. Those close to Porsche say the turning point came when the truth inside her started to feel heavier than the consequences of speaking it aloud. That realization didn't come suddenly. It came through exhaustion, reflection, and the growing awareness that she was losing touch with her own voice. Stepping back wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. And for the first time, Porsche allowed herself to admit that love alone wasn't enough if it required her to disappear. To the world, Porsche De Rossi and Ellen DeGeneres were the couple who had survived everything. Early backlash, relentless media attention, rumors, scandals, and decades of public opinion never seemed to shake them. Their 2008 wedding symbolized progress and visibility, a powerful moment that made many believe their bond was unbreakable. But insiders say the cracks began forming long before any public whispers of separation. What audiences saw was unity and affection. What those close to them noticed was a slow, quiet unraveling neither woman wanted to acknowledge. There were unspoken frustrations, emotional patterns left unexamined, and needs that no longer aligned. Like many long-term relationships, theirs didn't fall apart through explosive conflict. It shifted through silence, through compromises made too often by the same person, and through emotional roles that hardened over time. And once those roles solidified, changing them became painfully difficult. According to multiple sources, a major shift occurred after Ellen stepped away from her talk show in 2022. For decades, Ellen lived within constant structure, surrounded by staff, schedules, applause, and a sense of purpose that kept her emotionally occupied. When that rhythm ended, the quiet was jarring. Those close to the couple described the silence as almost hostile. Ellen reportedly needed more reassurance, more closeness, more emotional presence. Porsche, on the other hand, had spent years being the stabilizing force. She was tired. She needed space, autonomy, and the freedom to rediscover who she was outside of Ellen's orbit. What one partner needed to feel safe began to feel overwhelming to the other. The balance that once held them together quietly began to tilt, and neither knew how to correct it without confronting difficult truths. When the couple relocated to the UK in 2024, Porsche hoped the move would serve as a reset. A quieter life, away from Hollywood, felt like an opportunity to rebuild on steadier ground. But instead of relief, the distance brought clarity. Insiders claim Ellen began micromanaging daily life, not out of cruelty but fear. Where Porsche went, who she spoke to, how she spent her time, all became points of concern. What may have once felt like care slowly became suffocating. Porsche reportedly confided in friends that she felt watched rather than supported. She wasn't asking for separation. She was asking for space to think, to breathe, and to remember who she was when no one else was directing her emotional energy. That realization marked a quiet but irreversible shift. Long before recent tensions, the foundation of their relationship carried emotional complexity. When Porsche and Ellen first met in 2001, both were in other relationships. Their connection was immediate and powerful, but also complicated. Choosing each other meant dismantling existing lives, and that decision left emotional residue neither fully processed at the time. Portia carried guilt. Ellen carried fear of abandonment. Relationship experts often note that unresolved emotional fractures don't disappear. They resurface later, especially during times of stress. For years, love and success kept those wounds dormant. But when external stability faded, the old patterns quietly returned, influencing how each woman responded to fear, loss, and change. As Porsche Wright's career grew and Ellen became one of the most powerful figures in entertainment, emotional imbalance settled into the relationship. Porsche often became the emotional anchor, the steady presence absorbing anxiety and smoothing over tension. When Ellen faced public backlash during the 2020 workplace scandal, that dynamic intensified. Porsche stood beside her publicly, offering unwavering support. But privately, the emotional toll was immense. She had already spent years rebuilding herself after eating disorders and identity struggles. Becoming the sole emotional lifeline during Ellen's career crisis reopened wounds Porsche thought had healed. The imbalance, long softened by affection, became impossible to ignore. After Ellen's show ended in 2022, the shift became undeniable. Without the structure of daily production, Ellen struggled to adapt. Sources say she relied heavily on Porsche for stability. But Porsche, having worked hard to build independence and peace, felt herself being pulled backward into a role she no longer had the capacity to fulfill. Love hadn't disappeared, but energy had. The partnership that once felt mutual now felt one-sided. By the time they moved to the UK, Porsche was no longer asking whether she loved Ellen. She was asking whether staying meant losing herself entirely. Friends noticed subtle but meaningful changes in Porsche by early 2025. She became quieter, more reflective, carefully weighing her words. According to insiders, this was when she finally told Ellen she needed space, not as punishment, not as threat, but as necessity. Simple independence had become negotiation. Even small moments alone felt contested. Porsche realized she was shrinking to maintain peace, and that realization scared her more than the idea of distance ever could. She wasn't leaving to start over with someone else. She was stepping back to save herself. Privately, Porsche confronted a truth she had avoided for years. She entered the relationship young, vulnerable, and still discovering herself. Ellen had been her anchor during that period, but anchors can become weights when circumstances change. Porsche was no longer the fragile person she once was. She wanted autonomy, creative freedom, and emotional space. That shift terrified Ellen, who had already lost career stability and public favor. As Ellen held on tighter, Porsche felt herself slipping further away. When Porsche finally stepped back, the silence that followed was louder than any public statement. There was no dramatic confrontation, just an exhausted truth spoken softly after years of endurance. She didn't blame Ellen. She simply acknowledged that their life together had become too small for her to grow in. Taking space didn't mean love had ended. It meant self-love had finally resurfaced. Those closest to Porsche believe this moment is not just a pause in a marriage, but the beginning of a long-overdue personal awakening. For years, she lived within a structure that required constant emotional negotiation, where love existed but space did not. Stepping back has allowed her to reconnect with parts of herself that had gone quiet over time, her creativity, her independence, and her sense of emotional agency. Friends say she is not acting impulsively or emotionally. Instead, she is moving slowly, thoughtfully, and with an awareness she never allowed herself before. This chapter is not about erasing the past or rewriting history. It is about honoring the woman she has become, rather than the woman she needed to be to keep everything together. Whether this distance leads to reconciliation or permanent change, Porsche is finally prioritizing clarity over comfort, self-respect over routine, and emotional honesty over appearances. For the first time in decades, her life is no longer defined by what she must protect, but by what she needs to grow. This story is not about villains, betrayal, or dramatic collapse. It is about evolution, the kind that happens quietly, painfully, and often without warning. Relationships don't always end because love disappears. Sometimes they change because the people inside them do. Portia and Ellen built a life together during specific seasons of their lives, seasons shaped by fame, pressure, and survival. But seasons shift. Needs evolve. What once felt safe can begin to feel restrictive. And acknowledging that truth requires immense courage. Portia's decision to step back challenges a powerful narrative in Hollywood, the idea that endurance equals success. Instead, it asks a deeper question. What happens when staying costs your sense of self? Growth is rarely neat, and it rarely happens in sync. Sometimes, choosing yourself is not an act of abandonment, but an act of survival. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit that love alone cannot carry the weight of unspoken imbalance forever. Paragraph 15, expanded outro. After years of silence, Porsche De Rossi is finally choosing herself, not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of necessity. Whether this space becomes a bridge back to Ellen or a doorway into an entirely new life remains unknown. What is certain is that Porsche is no longer willing to shrink to preserve peace or perform strength for the comfort of others. Her story reminds us that self-discovery does not end with marriage, success, or public approval. It continues quietly, often painfully, when no one is watching. Now we ask you, what do you think? Can love evolve when identity has been rediscovered? Can distance heal what closeness strained? Or is this the beginning of a new chapter for both Porsche and Ellen, written separately rather than together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story powerful, meaningful, or relatable, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into Hollywood's most emotional untold stories.